Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this evening. During, well, a little before lockdown, I first started speaking to Bill. And then during lockdown, because I had too much time and too much money, I bought a load of prints off of his website. And he sent them over, and they look pretty amazing in my house. And anyway, we got talking, and he said, "Oh, I'm doing this book, The Last Dance," which he issued, and then it sold out really, really quickly. It was a paperback, and then we got into further discussions, and he suggested that maybe we print copies in the UK and do a hardback version. So here we are. We've gone into the publishing business, which is something I'd never thought I would say when I started Defected Records many years ago. But now we have a book that we are able to promote. And Colleen has decided, or very kindly joined us to ask Bill some questions about his life in the 70s and 80s in New York clubland. So thank you for Colleen, thank you for Bill, and thank you all for coming.
Hi everyone, I'm Colleen Murphy, and welcome to this fantastic exhibition that celebrates late 1970s discos and club culture in New York City. And it's done in association with the David Hill Gallery, Defected Records, and Glitterbox, celebrating the photographer Bill Bernstein, who's here with me, and his amazing work. I just want to give you a little bit of background about New York City and what it was like in the 1970s. It was a very challenging place to live. Crime was rampant. There were rats and garbage all over the New York City streets and the subways. And the city nearly went bankrupt. And the president at the time denied the city a federal bailout. That was President Gerald Ford. In fact, there was a very famous New York Daily News headline that said, "Ford to city, drop dead." But at the same time, it was also a hotbed of creativity, culture, and of course, hedonistic abandon, which was best expressed at New York City's nightclubs. And there were many different kinds of nightclubs too. So you had the nightclubs that were more commercial and uptown, you had the more underground dance scene in lower Manhattan, and also the neighborhood clubs in the outer boroughs, which really served the local communities. Photographer Bill Bernstein was there in New York City's disco heyday, while disco was still on a high, so to speak. Disco music and dancing had taken America by storm with the release of the Saturday Night Fever film and soundtrack. And overnight, everybody wanted to have disco dancing lessons, and every artist wanted to have a disco remix for their record. But it was almost too much too quickly. And within a few short years, the commercial face of disco had its legs pulled out right from under it. The first thing that happened was the Chicago radio shock jock, Steve Dahl, held a disco demolition night in Chicago's Comiskey Park, where they burned and exploded disco records. And this act had a lot of racial and homophobic undertones. But more tragically, the appearance of a new cancer that seemed to predominantly be affecting the gay community, and which later became known as AIDS, also curtailed the disco and nightlife scene, which was once again forced back underground, where it still thrived to this day. Disco never really went anywhere. It just went back underground. It's too much of a unifying agent to not have that flame to be kept lit. And disco still endures. Its legacy still lives on the dance floors throughout the planet. Well, this man here, he was there at disco's heyday in New York City, and he has offered us this kind of sneak glimpse of what it was like inside these iconic clubs, from the very big famous clubs to the more underground clubs as well. So thank you so much, Bill, for joining me.
No, pleasure to be here.
Well, I'd like to start, I think Studio 54 is a good place to start. It's world famous, it's synonymous with disco at its peak, opening in 1977 and shutting down 3 years later after its owners, Ian Schrager and Mark Rebell, were convicted of tax evasion. It's an iconic club, and in the photograph that we're showing you here, I like this photograph for many reasons, because you can see a crowd of hopeful people trying to get the eye of the door person who's standing on the top looking down at them, almost like the final judgment, And it was such a difficult place to get into. So many people wanted to get into Studio 54 because they saw all these iconic images of celebrities like Andy Warhol, Bianca and Mick Jagger, Liza Minnelli. And so they wanted to be in there and see what it was really like. And it was just so difficult. I mean, even Chic's Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards couldn't get in by the invitation of Grace Jones. So that's how difficult it was. So how did you make your way in there?
I'm extremely charming.
I know that already.
How did I make my way in there? Well, I tried to get in there a couple of times when I didn't have my press pass, and I couldn't get in. So I stood out there like the rest of these people for 45 minutes trying to get in, and I couldn't get in. But at the time, I was working at the Village Voice in New York City, which was a good job. It was my first job as a photographer. I had just started doing photography professionally like a year before.
And how did you get into it professionally?
How did I get into it?
Yeah, just quickly. Just give us a little...
I was shooting pictures of my friends and pictures of, street pictures. And I brought my portfolio up to the Village Voice, and I showed it to the art director one day, and he was looking through the pictures. And as he's looking through the pictures, a journalist, Richard Goldstein, who's a music writer, came in, and this sounds like the movie A Star is Born a little bit, but he came in and he said, "We need a photographer tonight for Tito Puente and Carlos Santana at Roseland."
Oh my gosh.
And the art director turned to me and said, "Well, do you want to do it?" And I was, sure, like I knew what I was doing, And so that night I was at Roseland, and I walked in, and I said, "I'm here from The Voice, and I'm here to shoot Carlos Santana." And they said, "Well, he's downstairs in his dressing room." So I went downstairs, and there was a guy standing outside of his dressing room, and I said, "I'm from the Village Voice." And he said, "Well, Carlos is in there. Do you want to go in there?" I said, "Yeah, of course." Again, like I knew what I was doing.
Just fake it.
So I walked in to the dressing room, and Carlos kind of looked over at me, and he was sitting on a chair with playing his guitar into an amp, and there was a picture of his guru.
Sri
What?
Yeah,
Exactly. And he was just warming up. He was just getting his head together, and playing guitar. And I was a huge Carlos Santana fan.
Me too.
You too. And so to be in that room with him, kind of channeling the music, was, for me, as my first professional assignment, was amazing. It was just me and Carlos and his music.
That's incredible.
And I took a couple of pictures and, watched him. And it was at that moment that I just decided that this is what I wanted to do for the rest of my life.
That's
because,
amazing.
I had access I had a reason to be there. And, I was, I was so moved by that moment, So,
Well, fast forward a year later, and then you're shooting at Studio 54.
exactly.
So you were telling us how you got in there, and I kind of sidetracked a little bit because I
Yeah.
wanted to learn a little bit more about you.
Yeah, that was my first experience. And then I started doing a lot of work for the Village Voice. And then one night they sent me to Studio 54 to cover an event. And I had no idea what to expect when I was given the assignment. It was really out of my realm, disco, the whole disco scene at that point. And I'm more geared towards the Woodstock, the 60s music and all that. So when they sent me there, like I said, didn't know what to expect because it had a reputation for being full of drugs, celebrities would go there. You know, it was just a really it had quite a reputation already. You know, and it just opened up a few months before. So when I went there and I walked in, I was surprised because it was full of people in tuxedos and evening gowns sitting at a table eating. And because it was an awards presentation for Lillian Carter. She had done some work in India. And so people were there, you know, at the celebration, this dinner. And Lillian Carter was sitting next to Andy Warhol.
Oh my gosh.
So there were these two white-haired people, older people, sitting at this table together talking. I mean, they were really engaged in the conversation. And that was the picture that I took for the Village Voice, basically. And they were, I still don't know what they were talking about. You know, I mean, they were two people from completely different walks of life, to two different realms.
I expect Andy Warhol didn't say much.
He listened a lot.
A man of few words.
Yeah. But they had something to talk about because they were talking for quite a long time. So that went on. They had a dinner. They had a fashion show. And I stayed there. And I did some other shooting. I was kind of fascinated by the paparazzi that were there because I'd never been in a situation with paparazzi before. So they were like grouped together and walking from, you know, table to table, photographing people and kind of stepping over themselves and climbing over themselves, you know. So anyway, I decided that I was going to stay there after everybody left because I didn't think I could ever get into Studio 54 again. So I had to buy some film from a photographer who was leaving, and because I had 3 rolls of film that I shot, and so I bought, I don't know, 5 or 6 or whatever it was rolls of film, and I went up to the balcony at Studio 54 and hid out and waited for them to clean up the tables and the floor and stuff and put that away, and then the regular crowd came in at about 11 or 12, I guess it was. And that's what I wanted to see. You know, I had no idea what to really expect. And so I walked down and I saw what I saw, and I was really kind of blown away by it.
What did you see? Did it meet your expectations or exceed your expectations of what Studio 54 would be like?
I don't know what my expectations were, actually. I had no idea what to expect. And what I saw that was so interesting was the cross-mixing of multiple cultures, is the best way to put it. There was a trans woman dancing next to a Wall Street guy. There was this couple in tuxedos that reminded me of like pre-war Berlin, you know, Weimar Republic, you know, gender bending kind of crowd, you know. I thought of the movie Cabaret.
Right.
You know.
Which was out at that time, I believe. It was right around the same time.
Yeah. And I thought, you know, I'm seeing something I've really never seen before. You know, I'm seeing a mix of marginalized cultures mixing with mainstream, well-heeled New Yorkers, mixing with, there was the queer culture was very big in terms of, you know, starting with places like The Loft with Dave Mancuso and Fire Island, Paradise, not Paradise Garage, but the Ice Palace. You know, so that influence was there. New York, you know, Upper East Siders were there. It was just a really interesting mix of people seamlessly on the dance floor together, partying.
Well, you mentioned my mentor, David Mancuso, and it's interesting because the first promoter at Studio 54 was Carmen D'Alessio, and she was a loftie. She used to go to the loft parties that David held, and David started his loft parties in New York City in the late 1960s, established them as a weekly party on February 14th, 1970. And he didn't start his parties to become a famous DJ. He started his parties because he was a massive supporter of the civil rights movement, women's liberation, gay liberation, and economic parity. And he wanted to create a safe space in which people from all different backgrounds, irrespective of race, gender, sexual orientation, or economic background, could come together and not just even socialize, but to build friendships. I mean, at his parties, sometimes it would be the first place where, an African American could have a white person as a friend. And vice versa. So it was a very much that kind of ethos. So Carmen D'Alessio, even though Studio 54 in so many ways is a polar opposite of David's house parties, which are very intimate and private and very non-commercial, very much more like the 1960s hippie ideal, Carmen D'Alessio did bring some of that to Studio 54 as well. What I find interesting is that you're not doing what the other paparazzi photographers are doing. You're not staking out, trying to get a photo of Andy Warhol. You're shooting the regular people on the dance floor. Why is that?
That was what was so interesting to me. As a photographer who was looking for something to do as a personal project, I think it was. And my influences back then were people like Brassai, who was called the Eye of Paris. And he was going in the 30s, underground to the Paris underground scene, where he'd shoot two women in tuxedos at a bar, and he was looking to see what was there, and he was capturing it with his camera and showing the world, basically. So people like that, photographers like that, were my influences. Little Diane Arbus in there. Just finding something that was going on that I wasn't aware of, that was totally out of my realm, that visually I could tell a story by. Some things that happen in the world that you can describe, you can write about, but you really can't photograph. This was something that was very photographable. So there I was,
Well, you have a lot of shots of Studio 54. And by the way, there are limited edition prints and posters available, and the book as well, which is a limited edition book as well. But you have many shots of Studio 54. You have the moon and the spoon shot, which, this is like wearing hedonistic drug culture on its sleeve. Were you... And then, the hedonism that took place there. Also, it was a form of theater and then a CBS broadcast studio for many years. And so they had all these different kind of lighting rigs and staging rigs. And you were telling me that the whole atmosphere could change throughout the night because they had all of this kind of apparatus to be able to do that.
Yeah, they were old theaters. So you could put scenery up there and drop it down during the course of the night, and then lift it up and drop something else down. So that was a part of the experience there. Was, you'd be dancing for 20 minutes, and when you started, the room looked one way, and then when you stopped, it looked completely different. You know, so it was exciting.
Now, did you get to have a dance?
Did I what?
Did you get to have a dance?
Did I dance?
Yeah.
I wasn't really. When I was there, I wasn't dancing. It was hard enough to shoot in a club that was dark.
Yeah.
And with strobe lights, with smoke machines. Any photographer who's worked with a smoke machine and a flash knows that that's a problem.
Yeah.
So it was pre-digital. So it was film. So I didn't see the pictures that I took until several days later, and sometimes I thought, wow, I got this great picture, and then I'd look at it and go, oh, I don't get it. It's completely out of focus. And sometimes I got stuff that I didn't imagine that I got. This picture back here, which we'll talk more about later, I think, was just one of those pictures that I just kind of held the camera up like this and took two or three frames, and I was
Pray
real
for the
happy.
best. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess photography was like that before we had it on our phones, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, why don't we move down to 43rd Street to Xenon?
Okay.
And Xenon was another club in Midtown that was not too far away from Studio 54. And in fact, the owners of Xenon, which was rock promoter Howard Stein and Peppo Vanini, who was a promoter at different European clubs, they actually met at Studio 54 and were inspired to start their own club. In fact, Xenon, if you have, do you remember your chemistry periodic table? Does anyone remember? What's 54? Element 54? Xenon. So even the title of the club was related to Studio 54. Yeah. And it became the place to go if you couldn't get into Studio 54. And it served mainly what we call in New York a bridge and tunnel crowd. So anyone coming in from the suburbs or the outer boroughs into Manhattan. Now, the thing that I love about this photograph is that people aren't standing there looking at a DJ booth with their hands in the air, fist pumping. They're looking at one another and dancing.
Right.
Now, this is just beautiful because this is the kind of clubs. There's all different types of people there. You know, people getting ready to kind of make out, but this hedonistic abandon. But it's also quite holistic, I think, in a sense as well. It's not just about hedonism. There's a kind of a communal spirituality, I think, that's also there. Would you agree? Did you find that at all?
Yeah, I did. I mean, what I saw back then was much more of this than what I see today. You know, in the music event world. You know, it was not so much about the DJ at all. It was really about the group that you went with. You went with 2 or 3 of your friends, and you spent the night with them, and you danced with them. And, you know, sometimes like places like Xenon or Studio 54, people would start dancing and then they'd sort of drift off and start dancing with the person next to them, and they'd move on, they'd dance it. So at the end of the night, you kind of dance with everybody in the room almost, you know? So it's much more focused on the interaction between people.
Yeah.
There was really not the DJ worship or anything like, you know, there wasn't. In fact, people didn't even know who the DJs were in those days.
Yeah, a lot of times they were hidden, and they weren't the kind of superstars that they are now in general.
The DJ booth was off to the side, usually up so they could look over, you know, and see the crowd. But they weren't focused on at all.
And how did you see this community and this crowd as different to Studio 54?
At Xenon?
Yeah.
It was, Studio 54 was, in its day, it was really at the height of disco dumb.
Yeah.
It was like, it was the place. There was really, in my opinion, probably many people's opinion, you know, there was no place like it. Which had a lot to do with, I think, Steve Rebell and Ian Schrager. And just the publicity machine that they had going, and it was just the place to go. You know, celebrities, that was the place to go. Xenon was trying to do that, and it was an old theater, and it had, you know, the scenery dropping down also. But it never really caught up to Studio 54. The crowd was, you know, like you said, if you couldn't get into Studio 54, you got into Xenon.
Yeah.
So the crowd was like, you know, it was less selective, I guess. It was, they would let people in that probably wouldn't get into Studio 54 because of the way they were dressed or their attitude or something like that. It was an upscale New York club. It was a great experience. They put on a great show, you know, but it just wasn't the celebrity factor that Studio 54 was.
But could you say it was almost more democratic, and maybe the people that were there weren't as concerned about being seen, but maybe more concerned with having a good time?
You could say that, yeah. It was definitely less of a celebrity scene. It was less of a poser scene. Thing about Studio 54 is you know, you just wanted to be in there because you felt like you were part of the club. You know, you were a member of the club if you were in Studio 54. And it wasn't so much with Xenon the same way. So in a lot of ways, it was a little more relaxed. You know, it was you didn't feel like you had to pose. You didn't feel like, you know, you had to put on any airs or that kind of thing. So,
was it still mixed in terms of sexual orientation?
Not as.
Yeah.
Not as. It was, it was mixed in terms of race, I would say. It was mixed in terms, there was a gay population there, I would say. There were also a few trans, mostly trans women who were there a lot of the time. And I think people called it like their place.
Right.
Miss J, Alexander, who a lot of people know, that was her place. That Studio 54 wasn't her place. Xenon was her place. So there were people that preferred Xenon over Studio 54. So.
Well, why don't we move along to a really incredible pop-up disco called their Clique, which was started by Stu and Marlene Feinstein.
Right.
And they held it in various Manhattan locations, including the Electric Circus. And they put a lot of emphasis on performance. So they had actors and acrobats and clowns all kind of in the mix, trying to encourage people to lose their inhibitions. They also had simulated sex acts. And this is like over a decade before Manumission, So this has kind of helped people loosen up. I mean, did people need help to be loosened up at this time, Bill? Did they?
Did they? I think they did, actually. Yeah. I think they always do. I don't know. But I mean, the thing about Le Clique is it's something that really reminds me of Glitterbox, and it was a traveling club. It wasn't a club. It was a membership kind of thing. And you would go there if you were a member, and you would bring your invited guest along. And they did have performers, and it was about loosening you up for the night, and they weren't really sex acts. They were, they were almost sex acts.
Sexy acts.
Yeah, sexy acts. Yeah.
Okay, let's say sexy acts instead.
Clowns,
That's weird, though. I don't think I'd want to see clowns. That's like scary.
Yeah. Clowns are scary anyway,
Yeah.
But but it really reminded me of Glitterbox and what's going on, in Ibiza and places like that.
Did you remember anything that was really stood out in your mind that maybe you didn't get a chance to photograph that night, or the photo just didn't turn out?
Yeah. Let me think. Let me see. I can't really think of anything.
Well, that's the best thing you can say about the 1970s is I don't remember, right? Thank gosh you had your camera.
Right. If I remembered, I wasn't really there, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
How about the music there? I mean, I'm not about specific DJs, but do you think the emphasis was more on the performance aspect, or was the music just as important?
I think they were both important. The Le Clique crowd was, I would say, what they call bridge and tunnel crowd, a lot of them, and the suburbs. And so they were, they were entertained by it all. They were, brought into it. And they did need a little coaxing, I would say, to get themselves going. But I think there was also a drug element there. I'm not sure what drug it was, but maybe cocaine, which was pretty big during that time.
Well, the Moon and the Spoon was at Studio 54 is a dead giveaway for that one. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But no, the Clique was interesting. It also, because it was at different clubs, like probably every month or two, whenever you got a chance to be in a different club that maybe you didn't necessarily go to on a regular basis. But they were like the Electric Circus, and Xenon, I think, hosted them a couple of times, and they were all around town.
So there's an element of surprise as well.
Yeah,
Great.
Exactly.
Well, let's move to the outer boroughs. Let's move to the borough of Brooklyn and the famous club Odyssey with its famous dance floor, which I'm sure you have seen in Saturday Night Fever, which, Saturday Night Fever, I think, is a great movie, and it depicts working class Italian Americans who kind of work hard all week, to live for the weekend. And I think this club Odyssey, which is where these dance scenes were filmed for Saturday Night Fever, on this dance floor, where the actual regular clientele were the extras in the film as well. You know, I think that's a similar kind of story, because it's in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, which was a predominantly a neighborhood where it was mainly people of Irish, Italian, and Scandinavian descent. Kind of more traditional family values, if you will, in that sense as well, and who, as I said, worked hard all week, lived for the weekend, and went to the Odyssey, which kind of really more served its community as opposed to people coming in from out of town to go there, I expect. So how did it feel to you when you were there shooting? I mean, how did the clientele feel different to the Manhattan clientele?
Yeah, well, it was very different. They were, I was surprised because I didn't know what to expect, you know, going out there. But I was drawn to it because it was so famous from Saturday Night Fever, you know, and that dance floor was so famous, you know, from that. So I thought I should go out there just to see what was happening, you know, and what the crowd was like. And it's in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is not Manhattan, you know.
Especially at that time. Because
Especially
parts
at
of
that
Brooklyn
time.
now
It's
are
different.
a bit more like Manhattan.
I mean, probably today, some of the more popular clubs are in Brooklyn.
Yeah, of course,
you know?
yeah.
The more interesting clubs are in Brooklyn. But back then, I mean, and even today, because I live in Brooklyn, but Bay Ridge, where the Odyssey was, is still pretty much working class, you know, Irish, Italian, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to see, you know, what was there. And I think that picture sort of describes it in a way. I mean, the dance floor was interesting and unique, but I mean, you can almost tell from the picture by the way people are dressed that it wasn't particularly out there, wild, flashy, fashion-oriented, crazy disco that you'd find in New York City. You know, it was still that crowd. And I went there a couple of times, and, you know, outside there was a disco sucks graffiti, you know, because
Really?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know that disco was especially accepted in Bay Ridge, you know. To see a disco and then outside disco sucks. I mean, it's kind of like the community is making comment, you know, on what they think about this disco being here, you know. So, but I'm glad I went. I'm glad I saw it. And I think when this place closed down, they auctioned off the dance floor.
Yeah, they did, yeah.
And some rich person in California, I think, bought it. And I think it's in their basement. So they probably have like disco parties on the weekend. Yeah.
And did you feel at home at a place like that in terms of it being maybe more neighborhoody and not as glamorous, or did you feel different yourself when you were there?
I didn't really necessarily feel at home. But it was so interesting because it was so famous, and yet it was so low key.
Yeah.
That was odd to me, you know?
That's interesting. And was it a big club?
No, it wasn't big. And I remember one night I went there, and the owner of the club, like, sort of, I told him what I was doing. I was doing this, you know, survey of discos and stuff. And so he and I were talking, and he spent a lot of time telling me about how, I can't remember the producer's name of Saturday Night Live.
Saturday Night Fever.
I mean, Saturday Night Fever.
I know.
Sorry.
I watched Saturday Night Live too.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I can't remember the producer's name, but he promised him some money to rent this club, and he never paid him. Okay, and this was like a year or two after the thing.
You're joking.
So I spent like most of the night like listening to this guy kind of complaining about how he never got paid.
I don't blame him. That's terrible.
Yeah, I don't blame him either.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
And you've shot other clubs in the outer boroughs too. I think Empire was another one as well.
Empire Roller Disco was in Brooklyn.
Roller Disco. Yeah, that's a great one. You have some great prints of that as well.
Yeah.
Really wonderful in the book. Let's talk about Crisco Disco, which I think is a really pioneering club, you know. Absolutely pioneering club. For one reason, its location was on 15th Street, West 15th Street, in what is known as the meatpacking district. And this is in the 1970s. Later in the 1990s, when I started DJing, there was loads of clubs springing up in the meatpacking district, and now it's like filled with different shops. You don't even go there anymore for clubbing. You go to Brooklyn. Yeah. So it's pioneering in that aspect, but it's also pioneering for the LGBTQ community as well. I mean, Crisco, just for those of you that don't know, in America is a vegetable shortening. And you can use your imagination as to what it's used for. But a lot of times, some of the gay clubs would like to use a kind of a name that would reflect a gay sexual experience in the title. So Crisco Disco is one of these. What was that like when you went in there?
It was a great club, actually, and it became sort of the club that people would go to at 4 a.m. After they finished going to Studio 54 or Gigi's Barnum Room or Xenon, whatever. When they were finished at that club, there were a couple of clubs that they would go to, and Crisco was one of them. Primarily gay, I would say. But I used to see Victor Hugo there a lot, who was Halston's partner.
The crazy one.
The crazy one, right. He was there a lot. But it was a place that you wanted to go. I think the Crisco name and the Crisco giant DJ booth was an attraction. Like, you just wanted to see it. So people from out of town, if they were in on a concrete convention from Idaho, or whatever. I just made that up. I don't know.
I'm trying to picture that.
Yeah, concrete salesman's convention, right? Anyway, they would go to places like Crisco Disco just because it was, there. They wanted to see it. They'd heard about it.
But was it where there are like overt sexual acts taking place there, or was it been a bit more tame than I have in my imagination?
I didn't see any overt sexual acts.
Right. So it wasn't like what the name of the place would imply.
No, I didn't see any. Yeah.
But in so many ways, you have to think Stonewall. The Stonewall riots happened in 1969, not too far from here, just in the West Village as well. And for those of you that don't know, it's when the police kept raiding this gay bar called Stonewall, and they were raiding it until finally these people fought back. So you had gay people and trans people all fighting back, fighting against the police, and they really made a statement. And then things started to change, and they were able to kind of be able to dance together, in public, and to be able to express themselves and their sexual identity in public. And the police started to leave these places alone. So this is really less than a decade after Stonewall, which I think is remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that was one thing about this period of time. The Stonewall riot was the beginning of gay liberation. The gay pride parades were started, I think, the next year. And then they've been going, now they're worldwide every year. So it was, it was the time of Stonewall. It was a time of the civil rights movements in the 60s. It was a time of women's liberation. It was just, there was a lot of social movements going on in the late 60s and early 70s. And basically, I see disco as being like a big party tent, that all of these movements that were gaining traction during this late 60s and early 70s, all of a sudden they flocked, under the tent and partied. And disco music was party music. The music I grew up with was, the Bob Dylan, it was even the Beatles. I mean, it wasn't I Am the Walrus, the music that you were listening to. It was, party music. So it was get up and dance, and celebrate. And they were celebrating.
But still, as you said before, just what you were saying before about how it brought all these different kinds of people together, there was a really incredible socio-political aspect to it. Yeah. Because it brought all these communities together more so than at rock concerts, like at a Bob Dylan show or a Hendrix show. The fact that you had all these people from all different backgrounds being able to celebrate together. And it's not like just sitting and watching a performance as you would be at the Fillmore East watching Hendrix play. you're part of the performance.
Yeah.
These people are part of the experience.
Yeah,
And, where all these inhibitions are let down. I think we always kind of focus on the hedonistic side of disco. And I don't think people really it's not always given the credit that it deserves as a kind of a social movement.
Yeah. It was a party, and I see it as a celebration of these different movements, creating some traction, in the world. And it was celebratory.
Yeah.
That's the right word.
Yeah, celebratory,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. I didn't mean celibate.
Definitely was a celibate. Well, let's go to our final club. We're going to go back downtown and head over to the Paradise Garage with this amazing, amazing shot.
Yeah.
The Paradise Garage was founded by Michael Brody in 1977. And not only did it have the city's best sound system, along with my friend David Mancuso's, but the Paradise Garage sound system had a lot more bass. It was a lot louder, a lot punchier, as opposed to David's kind of pure audiophile approach. But it also had arguably one of the best DJs that's ever graced the planet, Larry Levan. And he was also a devotee of David Mancuso's Loft. They were very good friends. And he did a lot of things like David did with the Loft. It was members only. The difference with the Paradise Garage is that you actually had to pay for a membership. With David, you never did. There was no alcohol served. You was bring your own. And there were also the sound system, of course, was a very important integral part to the whole experience, as opposed to. You would think that clubs would always pay attention to the sound system, but it's not true. I can tell you this from experience. But yeah, I think the members-only thing and not having a liquor license reflected what David had done with the Loft. Basically, the Department of Consumer Affairs in New York City tried to close down David's Loft space at 647 Broadway, and he was in one of the longest-running legal battles with that department. And he eventually won. And the reason why he won is because his party was private and because they didn't sell alcohol. And that became a template for nightlife culture throughout the city. So Larry Levan paid a lot of respect to David's ideals. And even though they didn't have the same type of a sound system, he did have Klipschorns, which were the loudspeakers that David used at the Loft, and we still use at the Loft as well. He had some in the DJ booth. But even though the Paradise Garage was members only, it was still a visible club. It was much more visible than David's private Loft parties. And because of its visibility, Larry Levan became one of the most popular DJs and remixers as well. And the Paradise Garage was also the inspiration behind Ministry of Sound here in London. So when you walked into the Paradise Garage and you went down that famous ramp, what were your initial experiences? How do you think, this must be different than Studio 54. This is different than Odyssey.
Yeah. It was a parking garage and converted parking garage. And to get in, you would walk up the ramp. Instead of driving up, you'd walk up, and they had like lights on the side. So it was like walking. It was like an airplane landing strip. There it is.
There it is.
Yeah.
It's on the book.
Which we've used on the cover of the book here.
Yep.
So it was, as I remember walking up the ramp and hearing the music in the background, and as I got closer and closer to the second floor. The vibration of the bass, from those speakers would start to vibrate my feet. And as I got closer, it'd go up my body, into my legs, into my torso. By the time I got to the door, my whole body was vibrating from the bass, basically.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And it was loud. It was really loud. And you'd make a right, walk into the place, and it was packed, like when I was there. And it would take about 10 minutes to get from the doorway to the other side of the club, because you'd have to walk through people. And it was an amazing sound system. The other thing that I felt, this picture here really sort of, describes what the place was like when you walk in there. And when I look at this picture, I smell poppers. The sound of, in fact, I thought we should get some, aerosol spray that smells like poppers for the room here. Because that was the smell of this room, if you can imagine that. It was sweat. This was a July night in 1979. It was about 3 a.m. And it was sweat and poppers and weed. And that's what I felt. And I got high being there. I wasn't doing anything. I was just in the room.
Contact high.
It was a contact high, for sure.
Or contact sheet high. I'm sorry, I had to do a little photography
That was
pun.
good. Yeah, okay. That's good. Good try.
That's right.
This night was the night that I actually went up to the booth with Larry. Mm-hmm. So, and I spent some time with him. And we didn't really talk very much because he was very focused on the crowd, which I think is what made him so great. That he was, I don't know, I think some DJs today go in with like a pre-programmed deal that they do. They plug in their little thumb drive and that's, I don't know about that, but
they do.
I've heard. But Larry was very much like impromptu, on the spot, like what's the crowd doing now? Do we need more energy? Do I need less energy? He would play movie soundtracks. He would play Motown. He would play
Pat Benatar.
All
all
exactly.
different. Stevie Nicks. I mean, he played all different types of songs. And I remember a friend of mine said he would hear him play like "Love Is a Battlefield," and everyone would sit down. Then he was obviously going through something. Then he'd play it again, like a few hours later.
Yeah.
A few people would start dancing. Then he'd play it again. More people would dance. And he said, and that's the song that you would leave. That song would be the song in your head when you left.
Yeah.
And the one that you woke
That's
up
right.
with
He
in
loved
your
that
head.
song from what I knew. Yeah. But he'd play anything, and that was what was so amazing about him, because you didn't know what to expect. And he was really reading the audience. And, he wasn't limiting himself in terms of where his catalog was, it was anywhere. But I had a chance to spend some time with him, so I got a shot of him, which has become like a kind of an iconic image of him with the Robin Williams album cover in the back. Mork. And then I went down to the club, and there were actually like some bleachers off to the side, and I just sort of sat there and watched the club, just saw what, tried to take in what I was seeing, and this is what I was looking at. And I was not supposed to take pictures in there. You weren't like allowed to take pictures, but I had my camera with me and my flash, and I just had to,
Yeah.
So I picked up the camera and I took like 2 or 3 frames, and I didn't know what I got. I came home, I developed the film the next day, I looked at the contact sheets and I saw that, and I just thought to myself, wow, that's exactly what I saw, and that's exactly how I felt, So to me, the picture is it, And like I say, I smell poppers when I look at that thing.
The other thing that I noticed too, and this is something I went to the clubs that were kind of the offspring of the Paradise Garage in the 1990s, like the Shelter and Body and Soul, and it was a very similar kind of look as well, just the fashion slightly different. But my point being, people went dressed ready to dance.
Yes.
It wasn't about a fashion show or being outrageous. It was like, what am I going to be comfortable dancing in for the next how many ever hours? And that's what I really see here as well.
Yeah. Now, you go to this club, or you went to this club with a group of friends, and you went to dance. You went to get high, and you went to dance, and that was the experience. And anybody was allowed in there. I mean, it wasn't all black, it wasn't all gay, it wasn't all anything, and it was a pure dancing club. That's all I can say. There was no posing there at all. It was diametrically opposite to Studio 54 in that regard, It was purely about getting down and dancing like through the night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your favorite club?
My favorite club, Paradise Garage was one of my favorite clubs just because it was so amazing energy-wise, okay? Just like it was just so, and I would get high just being there, you know? So that affected my opinion of the place.
Of course. Got better and better as the night went on.
It did. But I also liked, I did like Studio 54, but I think Gigi's Barnum Room was one of my favorite places, I would say.
You have a lot of photographs of that because it's another big performance element.
Yeah, they had the disco bats there, and there was a net above the dance floor, and so as you were dancing, people were on trapezes above you, which is weird, I think, but it was interesting. And there was a big trans population there, so to me that was interesting to be around a population that I'd never been around before, and to experience that and to get to know some of them and to just explore that whole world that they were in. It was interesting.
Well, by the time you finished doing your survey of New York's nightlife, disco commercially had kind of stopped in a commercial way. It went back underground.
Yeah.
This book came out called Night Dancing,
right.
Which I'm borrowing from you because it's very expensive to find a copy of it now. And all these great photographs. And then our friend David Hill discovered this book and got in contact with you and did an exhibition at his gallery.
Yeah.
And now, once again, there's a new edition of this book, Last Dance, here. You did the disco book with David.
Right.
And then the Last Dance one is the new one that's limited to 500 copies.
Yeah. This is a special Glitterbox.
Special Glitterbox edition.
Yeah. And there's only 500 copies. It's hardback. During COVID, I went through my 400 and change rolls of film, contact sheets, and just tried to find stuff that I hadn't discovered. I gave it like a deep look and came up with a lot of images that had never been seen before. So I put it in that book.
That's amazing.
Pretty
I look
happy
forward
about
to looking through that a little bit later. Are you surprised that there's still a demand and interest in these photographs? I
am. The interesting thing is, after I did this book which came out in 1980, okay, and sold about 40 copies, and then went to the remainder rack because that's when disco demolition happened, and Steve and Ian went to jail, and disco in America and in New York became sort of a dirty word. It wasn't popular. It had like over commercialized itself.
Very quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. So anyway, so that book came out and nothing really happened, and so I went on with my life as a freelance photographer, doing a lot of other things, and the 400 and change rolls of film were in a box, and they just like sat there. And in like 2002, I think it was, I got a call from David Hill, and he said, "Are you the guy that did this book? You're the Bill Bernstein that did this book?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, there's a real interest in that work, It's like, and the pictures in this book are so, really small. Would you be interested in doing like a big coffee table book?" And I said, "Absolutely." So we worked together on this. David did most of the work and found a publisher in the UK, and we did the book Disco, which is over there, and we had an exhibition at his gallery, and it sort of I became like
the disco don.
The disco guy, to my surprise.
Decades later.
And here I am today, sitting in front of this. But I'm really happy about it because to me, it was really an important period of time. And I think that my pictures talk about it and, remind people of that time period. And I think the most important thing to me about that time period was the idea of inclusion and the idea of acceptance and freedom of expression that was happening at that point, that little time period in New York, you know. And I think it's relevant to today's world, you know, when I look at, you know, just some of the, in America, some of the ways that people are kind of afraid of inclusion, you know, and the building a wall, you know, in Mexico and, you know, on the border, and, you know, the whole immigration issue, and just how it's a basic thing about, you know, being afraid of people that are different, you know, versus accepting, you know. So it's a big message. It's a big thing, you know.
It is a very big message, and that's why I think, you know, there's such a heavy social aspect to the whole disco movement that goes beyond the hedonism and the drugs and the music and everything else, and I completely agree. Well, we're grateful that you were there, kind of like a fly on the wall, and giving us this incredible glimpse of these nightclubs, you know, behind these closed doors that we aren't able to access. And now here we are. We can see the Paradise Garage dance floor. We can see what it was like in Studio 54, Xenon, and Odyssey, and Gigi Barnum Room, and all these Crisco Disco, and all these amazing places. So thank you so much for you know, doing that work, and thanks to everybody who helped preserve it, including David Hill and also Defected and Glitterbox for doing these events. Before we wrap up, I just want to mention to people that we are doing a party which will be streamed. I'll be one of the DJs, and I believe James Hillard from Horse Meat Disco will be DJing here on Thursday night as well, which will also be streamed on the Glitterbox YouTube and Facebook channels. So we'll be celebrating a bit more like they did. Well, do you think it's going to be like Studio 54? I don't know.
We'll see.
It depends upon the sound system and any poppers.
It depends on how crazy.
Well, thank you so much, and it's been a real joy to interview you and to learn more about you and what you experienced in 1970s nightlife in New York City.
Great.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of you for being here with us.
Thank you. Good. Very good.